Please note that everything I'm about to say is historically and factually accurate, just told from another perspective. The point of this isn't to defend the Soviet Union or to side with it. The point is to get you to think about biases we encounter when hearing about history. More about that in the conclusion. The Cold War started right after the Second World War, so to discuss it, we must start there. In 1939, the fascist armies of Germany invaded most of Europe. At the same time, the fascist army of Japan was invading China as well as other nations and colonies in the Far East. In 1941, the German fascists started a surprise attack against the Soviet Union in an attempt to destroy the socialist revolution and the Bolshevik government. Only through the sacrifice of the Soviet soldiers the German advance was halted. The balance of power slowly shifted as the centrally planned economy of the USSR was adapted towards wartime production. At this time, the capitalist countries finally decided to join on the side of the USSR, though it would take another 2 more years and millions of Soviet dead before they actually joined the fight on the ground. By the time D-Day had happened, the German army was in full retreat already and almost pushed out of the Soviet lands. Within 1 more year, the war in Europe was over and only Japan was still fighting. The Soviet army was advancing in Manchuria and Korea, just as the United States used 2 nuclear bombs on civilian targets in Japan, both to fight the fascists and to send a threat towards the Soviets. Japan was to be occupied by the United States exclusively. The US and USSR could not agree on what to do with Korea, most importantly what economic system it should use, so they decided to split it up and figure it out later. In Europe, the capitalist nations and the Soviet Union met in order to discuss how to prevent another European war and how to rebuild the destroyed continent. They couldn't agree on anything, most importantly what economic system the continent should follow, so they decided to split the continent up and figure it out later. The eastern countries were to be rebuilt by the Soviet Union and the western ones by the US, UK and France. Germany, right in the middle, was split up between the USSR and the capitalist nations, with Berlin being split up again. The Soviet Union was not able to support the eastern nations as it had to rebuild itself first. In the western nations, the free market was instituted and quickly did absolutely nothing. The US government did what it always did, and does, when capitalism isn't working, and gave away free money to stimulate the economy. This was called the Marshall Plan. To be more specific, capitalist nations were given US dollars, which had to be used on imports. I wonder what kind of country had an export-oriented economy which wasn't damaged in the war and which accepted US dollars. Well, so essentially the US government was giving money to their friends which they then had to spend on US goods. In addition to this, much of the industry of Western capitalist nations was bought up or indebted to American capitalists and banks, who loaned money to the rebuilding continent. On top of that, the USA used the political leverage they got from the Marshall Plan to influence the elections in nations they occupied, towards liberal free market economies. Essentially, the Western European nations were turned into economic colonies or puppet states of the US. When Germany was split up, the 4 powers agreed on some conditions and rules they would follow in this joint occupation. Among them, they decided to use the same currency in Germany in order to make the reunification easier. This German currency was plagued by hyperinflation, which made the occupied territories illegible for the Marshall Plan. The obvious solution by the capitalist nations was to introduce a new currency. They did not discuss this at the 4 power meetings, they did not even inform the General Secretary of the Soviet Union. They just did it. This was seen as a breach of international law by the USSR, which then left the 4 power meetings altogether. The General Secretary was not happy with the partition of Germany in general. Pretty much all natural resources and industry of Germany are located here, outside of the Soviet zone. This was seen as an injustice as the USSR had lost most blood in defeating fascism, and it felt like it deserved a richer area to pay reparations. The only industrial region of the Soviet occupation zone was Berlin, and Stalin demanded all of it so they may pay reparations. So Stalin demanded that the Allies stop their occupation of Berlin. When the Allies refused, he blockaded it. The blockade is when the Cold War officially starts. The Allies used planes to fly the supplies in, by the way, and Stalin stopped the blockade after about a year. And shortly later, the capitalist powers gave up any pretense of allowing Germany to unify, as they set up their own capitalist puppet state in their zones of occupation. A short time later, Stalin decided he could no longer occupy Germany and gave them a state of their own, the German Democratic Republic. Germany was now split. Stalin made a suggestion to the capitalist nations. He wanted to create a unified democratic Germany with international supervision. The Western nations declined this offer because they were afraid that the large socialist population in Germany may democratically vote to become socialist. And we all know that the problem with democracy is that sometimes the people vote differently from how you want them to. And the adult way to react to that is to simply not allow them to vote at all. On a strategic level, Europe was now divided and the capitalists were gearing for war. The British Prime Minister Winston Churchill outright prepared a plan for the invasion of the Soviet Union called Operation Unthinkable, and the US Army was stationing bombers with nuclear bombs around the world in order to threaten and eventually destroy the Soviet Union and the socialist revolution therein. Luckily, there were people in the United States who were on the side of the people and who decided to send plans of the nuclear bombs to the Soviet Union. By 1949, the USSR had tested its first nuclear warhead. The US and USSR would continuously develop new and stronger nuclear weapons for the entire Cold War in order to keep the advantage on their side for when the inevitable war between capitalism and socialism would start. Meanwhile, in the United States, everyone who was a communist or a suspected communist was fired, arrested, and worse, in what's known as the McCarthy era. Throughout this, the United States still claimed to support freedom of expression. Then, in order to totally not escalate the Cold War, the capitalist nations banded together and formed Nato, an aggressive military alliance designed to threaten the Soviet Union and contain the revolution. Let's have a look at China. It was in a civil war. The main factions were the Communist People's Liberation Army under the leadership of Mao Zedong and the practically fascist Chinese Nationalist Party under the leadership of some fascist guy, I don't know, you won't remember the name anyway. They have been fighting since before World War II, then stopped when the Japanese showed up and started doing genocide, and right after the Japanese had surrendered, they were at each other's throats again. Long story short, the communists win and the nationalists have to go on this island. They pretend to be the real China until this day, though nobody takes them seriously. In Korea, both the USA and USSR had installed temporary local leaders, which acted as placeholders until the peninsula would be united again. But after the capitalist nations had made it clear that the United Germany would not happen unless the Soviet Union agreed that it would be a capitalist state, the government in North Korea became a bit anxious. It was a socialist government backed by the USSR. The South was seen as occupied territory by the North, especially as the fascist capitalist government there was close friends with and funded by the American government. The Southern government committed many war crimes against suspected communists, often under the direction of US troops. By 1950, the North Korean government under Kim Il-sung decided to put an end to the fascists and started a liberation war against the dictatorship. When almost the entire peninsula was liberated, many capitalist nations came to support the fascist dictatorship. The effort of half of the world was not in vain, and the North Korean army was pushed back. Fearing that the capitalists might just keep going and invade Manchuria after they were done with Korea, Chairman Mao Zedong decided to send support to Korea. That support came in the form of 500,000 soldiers. The US general wanted to use nuclear weapons on the Chinese People's Liberation Army, but the president refused because of the fear that the Soviet Union might intervene and use their own nuclear weapons as well. After 3 years, the fronts were back to where they were before, and the Korean governments agreed on an armistice which is in power until today. The South Korean people suffered under a series of US-backed fascist dictatorships until 1987, when they moved to a neoliberal democracy. Let's have a look at Germany again. Corrections, Germanies, plural. In the 50s, they were brought up under drastically different economic systems. West Germany was organized in a capitalist free market economy, and at first it wasn't doing well. After being included in the Marshall Plan, however, it quickly started doing pretty well. Remember, the Marshall Plan was basically the US giving free money to capitalists to help them fund businesses and such. Meanwhile, East Germany had a centralized socialist economy which had a harder time growing, since they didn't have access to the same amount of free money. Also, the Soviets had taken loads of money and industrial machinery as reparations, since Germany kind of destroyed all of Russia like 5 years earlier. On top of that, the East German economy was smaller at the beginning of the separation, as I've mentioned before. So economically, West Germany was doing better. But East Germany had its perks, among others a 0% unemployment rate, free healthcare, free education, and so on. West Germany had none of those at this time. So the East had many highly educated people who were educated by the state and expected to help improve the country in exchange. So it kind of sucked for the East German government to see the West Germans handing out free money to everyone with higher education who would move from East Germany to West Germany. The West German government also made sure to spread lots of propaganda about how anyone could become rich under capitalism. So young people who were educated for free by the East German state and who were expected to return this value to the state via working there decided to leave to a capitalist country in hopes of making themselves rich off their stolen East German education. This was seen as a betrayal by the East German state, and some went as far as to denounce those who left for West Germany as traitors to their nation. And there were more problems originating in West Berlin. The Cold War was a really good time for spies. The West was spying on the East and the East was spying on the West. Remember the nuclear bombs from the US? They were brought to the USSR by spies. And there were many spies moving from East to West and the other way around. And the key path they used was Berlin. The reason for that is that there was no border there. You could just walk down the street and you'd be out of the country you're spying on and inside the country you're spying for. And at one point the Politburo decided to handle these problems originating in Berlin accordingly. In order to stop the traitors and spies, the decision was made to impose the border in Berlin the same way the outside borders of the country were imposed. This meant border guards, checkpoints, barbed wire, and no crossing without reason. The capitalist countries were quick to complain about the Berlin Wall, as it became known. They said the East German government had torn Berlin apart. A brave statement considering it was the Western powers that continued to occupy half of the capital city of another country. Like, can you imagine Saudi Arabia occupying half of Washington DC and then complaining that the US is tearing Washington apart when they begin to guard their border? Okay, while I'm outside of the monologue, I'd like to address some serious misinformation about the Berlin Wall. It's often said that it was locking people in or out, and that's not quite true. If you were West German and wanted to go to West Berlin or the other way around, you could just use the East German highways to do so. West Berlin was not trapped, they could leave at any time. And it is often said that the wall was tearing families apart by preventing travel. That's a very biased way of telling the story. East Germans were allowed to visit West Germany provided they had a reason, and a marriage, a funeral, or even just visiting a sick relative were enough. And West Germans could visit East Germany just as well. Saying that the wall separated families is technically true, but by that logic you'd have to agree that all borders do so, and that thus all borders should be considered as bad as the Berlin Wall, which is a road you could go down, but it isn't usually thought to its conclusion like that. Anyway, where was I? Oh yeah, the Berlin Wall was built and enforced as a regular border. This stayed up for a bit and will return to Germany once something happens there. Meanwhile, in the USSR, Stalin died and Khrushchev was telling everyone that he was bad. This started a tradition of Soviet leaders being shit-talked once they died, something that did not help the Soviet Union with stability. In order to counter NATO, the Soviet Union founded the Warsaw Pact, a military alliance with the express goal of countering NATO, not threatening the USA, just creating a counterweight to capitalist aggression. Also, the nations have now figured out how to make even more deadly bombs and how to use rockets to deliver them without them being intercepted. These rockets could also be used differently. In 1957, some Soviet scientists got very excited to use those missiles to learn stuff about space. And after a bit of development, they managed to put the first ever artificial satellite in space, Sputnik. It was just a silver ball going beep beep in space, but it was a tremendous achievement for humanity. I say for humanity, and in the socialist nations it was definitely seen as such, but in the capitalist nations the public reacted differently. They were scared of Sputnik, because now suddenly they saw that the socialist nations were technologically superior. This was known as the Sputnik crisis. The USA then decided to do the same and put an artificial satellite in orbit. The first rocket promptly blew up on the launch pad in front of the media of the whole world. Then the Soviet Union sent a dog to space. Her name was Laika, and she was the first living animal ever to reach space. Then the USSR sent a man to space, then took the first picture of the dark side of the moon, the first automated landing on the moon, the first woman in space, the first landing on another planet, all with the US lagging behind the Soviet Union. So, in an effort to not look totally inferior anymore, the US president announced that they would land on the moon. Long story short, after enlisting literal genocidal Nazis in their spaceflight program, they managed it. Then they stuck their flag into the moon, presumably in an attempt to make it theirs, and declared that they had won the space race. Before that, the Soviet government put out a statement declaring moon landings are too dangerous to attempt. The landing was seen live on TV by billions of people, including in the Soviet Union. The government of the USSR then suggested a joint moon landing as a sign of friendship. While the USSR never landed on the moon, there was a joint mission between American astronauts and Soviet cosmonauts in 1975, when they docked their spaceships and said hi or something like that. Let's now have a look at Cuba. Cuba belonged to the US for a long time. Then these handsome men came along and made it not so. They did a socialism, so the US tried to invade but failed. Quick look at Turkey. They joined NATO and the USA had set up nuclear missiles there which could directly attack Moscow and kill millions of people. After the Cuban Revolution, the Soviet General Secretary called and asked if they wanted to help do the same to the US. Cuba agreed and the USSR was about to place nuclear missiles there when the Americans noticed. The US president did not want to allow the USSR to do the same as they had done, so he forbid Cuba to place Soviet missiles there. Then they enforced a blockade on Cuba, which they enforced by throwing depth charges at Soviet submarines, which were armed with nuclear weapons. Please note that this is an act of war, both the blockade and the throwing depth charges at the nuclear submarine. But hey, what could go wrong? It's not like the crew of the submarine could have assumed that war had broken out and that they should fire their nuclear torpedo at the American fleet, right? Oh yeah, that's exactly what happened. The world came within one decision of a nuclear war because the capitalist country didn't want to allow another country to do the same thing they had done, and because it had decided that attacking a nuclear submarine was somehow okay. It turned out well in the end. The USA agreed to remove nuclear missiles from Turkey, and the USSR agreed not to put nuclear missiles on Cuba. In case you were wondering, no. The international community did not take action against the USA for attacking the ships of a country they were at peace with, or for enforcing a blockade in peace times. Let's have a look at Vietnam, shall we? So basically in the before times, that means before 1900, France came along and took this land. That's imperialism. Skipping over a lot of history, the people here did not like being a colony of France anymore, and after World War II, France was not able to kill all of them anymore, so in 1954, at the Geneva Conference, they decided what to do with this area. They decided to split it up into these three countries. These two became monarchies. But wait, Vietnam had lots of communists in it and they wanted to rule the country. But the capitalist countries did not want that. The US and USSR could not agree on what to do with Vietnam, most importantly what economic system it should follow, so they decided to split it up and figure it out later. But unlike with Germany and Korea, this time they had agreed on how to figure it out. This part would be communist, this part would be capitalist, and in 2 years they would unify and hold one national election under international supervision to decide what economic system all of Vietnam should use. What a great solution! Unfortunately, it was predicted that the North would win because it had a higher population. So the US decided that rather than risking the small country doing what the people want, they should launch a full-scale invasion. Essentially, the Vietnam War boiled down to the capitalists thinking they would win because of their technological superiority, but then getting wrecked by a few farmers armed with AK-47s. By 1974, the US president decided to retreat and give up while pretending that they totally won. The capitalist southern government fell within 1 year and all of Vietnam was now socialist. Let's now look at Afghanistan. To sum it up painfully quickly, the government was overthrown by a new socialist government known as the Democratic Republic of Afghanistan. This government was quickly attacked by reactionary insurgencies and then asked the Soviet Union to help. And as you do among comrades, in 1979 the USSR intervened. The USA then gave lots of money to the people fighting the USSR, that being Al-Qaeda among others. After about 10 years, the Soviet government decided it could no longer deal with this and left again. The Democratic Republic of Afghanistan then quickly fell to the reactionary armies. Those armies then later blew up 2 towers in New York, but that's a different story. At this time, the Cold War was warming up. This is known as détente. The USA and USSR were still pointing nuclear weapons at each other, but now at least they weren't throwing live bombs at nuclear submarines anymore. They signed the SALT Treaty, which stands for Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, which limited the number of nuclear bombs and missiles they could make. As is tradition, I completely neglected Latin America in this video. Basically, it's always the same story. A country elects a socialist government and then the CIA stages a coup and kills all suspected communists and props up a fascist puppet regime there. There's a Wikipedia article about it. If I mentioned all of those, the video would be twice as long. In the late 80s, the German people were demonstrating against the Berlin Wall. To oversimplify, they had been talking about letting people travel over the inter-German border without visa for some time. Then this man misread something in a press briefing, and as a result, half of the population of East Berlin wanted to go have a look at the West. They thought they had the right to cross the border now. The guards still had orders not to let them pass. Eventually, they could not hold the people anymore and just let everyone go to West Berlin. The Berlin Wall was gone now. Please note that most people in East Germany did not want to live under capitalism or to unite with capitalist West Germans. What they wanted was a new and more democratic East German Republic with good relations with and free movement to West Germany. 71% of East Germans opposed the unification of Germany. Unfortunately, the Chancellor of West Germany wanted to get re-elected, so he united the two countries against the will of the people. There is a video to be made on this, since 30 years later the old East German states still suffer immensely from this, and they likely will for the next 50 years. Things like these were happening all over the socialist world, and many countries reformed their way into or were forced into free market capitalism. Then Gorbachev came into power in the USSR and he implemented perestroika and glasnost, which were policies that had to do with, well, actually the collapse of the Soviet Union is definitely gonna be its own video, so subscribe. Essentially he did some reform, screwed it up and collapsed the Soviet Union in the process. And this is where the Cold War ends, with the collapse of the Soviet Union. And this was my biased telling of the story of the Cold War. Please know, everything I said was correct. It's all true. So why does it sound like I'm an evil Soviet spy sent to indoctrinate everyone into thinking the capitalist nations were aggressors in the Cold War? Because we aren't used to hearing that part of the story. When talking about the Cold War, we hear about the Berlin Wall tearing families apart all the time. But we never talk about the fact that the US invaded a sovereign country because they were afraid that an election might go differently from how they wanted to go. We are used to thinking that the Soviets were aggressors in the Cuban crisis, placing missiles and such, but we barely even mention it. The US had been doing the same thing in Turkey, or that the US literally breached international law by imposing a blockade on Cuba during peacetime, and by attacking Soviet submarines. And we're used to thinking about the Soviet nations in the East as the Soviet bloc, but we barely even talk about the fact that the entirety of Western Europe was practically controlled by the US. Do you think it's a coincidence that no nation occupied by the Americans turned socialist? The Americans made sure to only support the correct parties, the same way the Soviets did. So, now you know the Soviet version of the story. Do I think that we should write this version in the history books? Not really. It's just as biased as the story we already hear, and it's based on some shaky facts just as well. I'd like to hear a story without bias for once, not one where evil Stalin tried to starve Berlin into submission, or one where the evil capitalist nations refused to vacate the capital of a sovereign state. I want a story with both sides, not just the one we like better. Ultimately, it might be impossible to tell a story without bias, but at least now, after having watched this, you might be a bit better at detecting subtle biases. Always ask yourself what the other side of the story may look like, because maybe the Soviet side of the Cuban Missile Crisis might seem a lot more reasonable than the American one. Thanks for watching, I hope you enjoyed this video of mine. If you did, please leave a like and so on. I'd like to thank my patrons for motivating me to make videos, and I'd like to say an extra special thanks to Aaron J. Patton and Generikis77 for your generous donations.